Ruben Schwartz, your host and chief nerd. Welcome to Sales for Nerds, the podcast for people who love using their expertise to serve clients but maybe aren't quite so enthusiastic about the sales and marketing aspects of the business. I struggled with this for years, ironically, as a sales and marketing consultant to the Fortune 500. Over time, I realized that there was a more effective, more authentic way to get clients by helping instead of selling, teaching instead of marketing, and connecting instead of networking. My mission is to help you learn the easy way instead of the way I learned it, by sharing my stories, by bringing on awesome guests to share their stories. And of course, as a software guy, I had to go and create the CRM I wished I'd had when I was struggling with more traditional systems. It does more of what us solo consultants need, help us nail our positioning, help us get more leads and conversations off our website, get more referrals, have more conversations, automates proposals all the way through to e-signature and more, and less of the bloat that comes with traditional CRMs. If you want to check it out, you can start a free trial at mimiran.com. That's MIMIRAN.com. And you can even just sign up for the free version, which helps you nail your positioning. And you can also find proposal templates, lead magnet ideas, and more. Once again, that's MIMIRAN.com. Now let's get to it. Today, I'm super excited to have with me Sarah Elkins, the owner of Elkins Consulting and the host of the podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. She has recorded over 180 episodes so far. Bravo. I haven't even cracked 70 yet. And she also released a book inspired by the podcast, which also is called Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. Sarah helps people uncover the stories that are holding them back, the stories that created internal messages that are keeping them from experiencing their full magic. And she also helps people frame those stories so that executives and leaders and public speakers and job seekers can demonstrate their character and values and vision and communicate who they are more clearly to the world. Sarah lives in beautiful Montana, and if you get the audio version of her book, you get a special bonus, 2 songs she recorded with one of her bands, Spare Change. The other band is called Rocket to Uranus. I kid you not.
Yes, really.
And I said that without laughing. I'm so proud of myself. It happens to be a 60s cover band, and she's also a jazz vocalist, multi-talented. Sarah, welcome to Sales for Nerds. What do you have in your glass?
I have a fabulous old-fashioned that my spouse made for me. He happens to be an amazing mix master when it comes to cocktails.
Awesome. Is this some like special recipe that we should put in the show notes?
I don't know if he actually writes down any recipes. He kind of makes it up as he goes along. I can tell you he's made a Montana Manhattan with a bourbon made at Willie's Distillery in Ennis, Montana, which is famous for their trout fishing.
Okay, awesome. I am far too lazy to make cocktails, as listeners probably know. So I have got this Thomas Jerry Seven Hills Vineyard, and it's an Oregon blend, 60% Cab, 28% Merlot, 12% Cab Franc. It is wonderful. So cheers, Sarah.
Cheers.
Tell us a little bit, how did you get started in this notion of helping people figure out their stories? That doesn't seem like a typical career that we grow up thinking about.
Oh, gosh, no. It's funny because I tried a lot of different things before I got here. And when I look back, I realize they all prepared me to do what I'm doing. I worked in the public sector for nearly 20 years, project management, software implementation. I actually was doing public affairs for a city government. And all along those experiences, I was collecting stories from people. I would ask them about really specific things that happened to them. And then I could repeat them back to them, but with the most important points that they had kind of glossed over. And it was when I first started coaching and I was considering starting a podcast that I talked to one of my clients who happened to have MS. She is also this phenomenal human being, an incredibly entrepreneurial professional, and has done some amazing things despite her illness, disability. But when we were talking, I asked her why she didn't talk about her MS. And she said, well, I don't want to be defined by it. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, when people hear that I have MS, they immediately think of me as that woman with MS. I said, well, maybe you think of you that way, but I don't think others immediately think of you that way. And she said, why do you say that? And I said, well, when you tell me stories related to your MS that you won't include in your public speaking, I haven't seen it in any of your content, but when you talk about it, all I see is this resilient, persistent, incredibly motivated, and inspiring woman. I don't see that woman with MS. And I could see her eyes light up with this realization that this is part of her, but it doesn't define her. And I said, it's not the things that happen to you in your life that define you, it's how you talk about those things. And all of a sudden, I had the title of my book. Your stories don't define you, how you tell them will. But it started as the title of my podcast. It didn't become a book until probably a year into the podcast when I realized people need help collecting those stories. And that's what the book does.
So how did you get the name for the podcast? How did you decide that you're going to start a podcast in the first place where you help people with this storytelling issue?
Well, I'm an accidental podcaster, and you wouldn't know that with 180 plus and 3 years of podcasting, but really I'm an accidental podcaster. I was planning my conference. It's called No Longer Virtual, and it was going to be the second conference of that title. And I was talking to one of the people that has been one of my close tribal members. His name is Neil Hughes out in the UK, and he helps people start podcasts. It's part of his service. And he has had a podcast for years and thousands of episodes. And I asked him, I said, if you're going to come to NLV all the way from the UK, I'd love for you to host a session on building your brand through multiple media and talk about starting a podcast. And he said, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, we could do kind of a panel discussion. We have some authors in the group. We have some podcasters. We have some videographers. I said, yeah, but you know what would be really cool is if you started somebody with a podcast and kept a journal, if you both kept a journal of starting a podcast and what went right, what went wrong, what were the steps, then you could really have like this experiential conversation. And he's like, that's a great idea. Who did you have in mind? And I said, well, at least 3 people at No Longer Virtual in 2017 mentioned an interest in starting a podcast. I'll reach out to them. So I did. And every one of them turned me down. Every one of them said either, I don't have time, or I can't take on another project, or I don't like the sound of my voice recorded. And I was shocked. This is like a $5,000 to $10,000 gift I was offering to somebody. And they all turned me down. And it was around the time I was preparing to perform a story at a storytelling event called Tell Us Something in Missoula, Montana. And I performed this story in front of a nearly sold out crowd at the historic Wilma Theater in Missoula. But I was really nervous about it. And I was talking to one of my LinkedIn connections about it. And then we segued into this conversation about the podcast thing. And he said, Sarah, I can't believe you're not doing this yourself. And I said, oh, but I don't have time. I have too much on my plate. I don't like the sound of my voice recorded. And he said, Sarah, you are a storyteller. You help other people tell their stories. It just makes sense that you incorporate all of that into your business. And I realized he was right. And Neil and I started my podcast in December of 2017 so that we could have a full case study by February of 2018. And we never stopped.
That's awesome. And now I want to rewind even further, because at this point you already have a business that is centered around stories. Mm-hmm. Let's rewind to how you got into that. How did you know that stories were such an essential thing? And what made you say, I'm going to, not only is it important, I'm going to go build a business around it?
Well, that's a really good question. And really, I started with this idea of being a communication coach. In all of my experiences, especially in the public sector, I realized one of the reasons so many people hated their jobs was because of all the miscommunication around them. People were speaking different languages, even if they were speaking the same language. So the way I describe it using StrengthsFinder terms is, sometimes some people speak in bullet points and others speak in full sentences. And then I might even go into something that's even more visceral, which is some people speak in German and some people speak in Italian, even though they're both speaking in English.
Okay.
And my goal the ultimate goal for the work that I was doing with my clients was to improve communication, which improves people's experiences at work and improves their relationships across the board. If they can understand how to present something to somebody who speaks a different language than they do, in a way that's productive and kind and compassionate, then all of their relationships across the board improve. So that's how my business started. But what was interesting was that as I would be having these conversations with my coaching clients, I would ask them to tell me about a time when they had something really good come out of a conversation. And then we would talk through that story, and I'd realize where they were getting in their own way in terms of their internal messages, because they'd have this whole internal dialogue and judgment against themselves, against the person they were speaking with. And it didn't make sense until I understood the story that created that judgment.
So I want to get into that in just a moment, but I'm curious, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are curious. When you started this business, how did you get your first clients?
Oh, well, my first couple of clients, my very first one was somebody who wanted to get into public speaking. And she is a very successful business owner here in Helena, Montana. And she really wanted to, well, she was invited to present to over 200 women in Bozeman, Montana at a women's leadership event. And she was kind of freaking out. And she called me knowing that I had done a lot of public speaking and that I was a good teacher. And so she called me and said, I don't even know what to talk about. Like, why are they asking me? I don't know what they want from me. And over the course of a few sessions, first of all, I uncovered her major points of interest in terms of what she would want an audience to get out of the conversation. Like, when they walk away, what do you want them to be thinking about? What do you want them to be inspired to do? And then we started talking about the stories of her life that make her an inspiring person. And this is actually one of my favorite experiences. Was I found out that she had always wanted to be a puppeteer. Now, she grew up in Poland, and there's like this fancy school for puppeteers in Poland. And she really wanted to go there from the time she was a preteen, and she was not in a wealthy household. It was a hard place to be growing up. And by the time we got through the planning for her presentation, her speech, we had come to this point where she actually brought a puppet on stage with her and introduced her presentation through the puppet.
Hmm.
And it was a huge success. She had so many requests for further communication, for business development requests for her business. She was inundated with all kinds of comments and confessions of other people. And you know how that goes when you're a speaker. People have a tendency to tell you things they wouldn't tell other people. And it was just a huge success. So that was my first client. And I realized the power of uncovering those particular stories with very specific time periods, a location, very specific props or parts of the story that you could practically see when they talked about it. And then my next client was a medical sales device guy. And he did all of his sales over the phone. So we did all of our coaching appointments over the phone because I figured if his clients can't see him, then I shouldn't be able to see him either. And again, we came to these conclusions of why he was getting in his own way as far as being successful in his sales. He was already successful, but he knew he could do better. And it was partly something that somebody had said to him years before. And we uncovered this story about how this person was sure he would never be anything. He would never amount to anything. It was one of his teachers, and it was a horrible experience. And listening to it just made my toes curl. But hearing it, I realized where that internal message came from. And we were able to shift that story so that he could share it in a way that demonstrated his resilience rather than making him feel like a victim.
Okay. So a lot of this, it seems like maybe I'm just reading too much into a couple examples, but it seems like we sort of internalize negative aspects of some of the stories, some of the things that happen to us, and you help people take the same experience, but tell it in a way where it's like instead of being a dark tragedy where the anti-hero whiles away in misery, they overcome it in sort of the hero's journey, and they are now empowered or stronger because of what they went through. Am I hearing that correctly?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the reality is that our memories are fallible. Every time we tell a story, our memory shifts. There's all kinds of research to support that. And given that's the circumstance, why would we not tell the story in a way that empowers us?
So
Does that make sense?
it makes absolute
Yeah.
perfect sense. And it's funny because I'm not a storytelling expert by any chance, by any stretch, but I find myself using the word story a lot with my clients, right? I tell people a proposal is a story, not a brochure. I tell people that the bio on their website sucks. What's their origin story? And right, try to get people to share a little bit authentically, which is one reason I was so excited to have you on the show, because this is what you actually do. I'm just there like almost like a friend saying, hey, you're really cool, you should share that with people, but I'm not a storytelling expert. So what kind of mistakes do people make when they think about their stories internally first, right? Because if they don't think about it right internally, they can't really share the right stuff with other people.
Well, the first mistake I think people make is that they think their stories have to be epic. They think I don't have any stories if I don't have a celebrity sighting story or an I almost died but I survived story. Um, they think that those are the big important stories that people want to hear. But that is just not the case. People want to hear stories that are meaningful to you because they can feel it. When you tell a story of something joyful that you experienced, their brain has these mirror neurons that when you talk about joy and you really emote that joy when you tell the story, they feel joy. Their brains actually feel joy in the same way you, as a storyteller, is feeling it. So the first mistake is that people think that they have to have an epic story when really a meaningful story could be as simple as I remember when my older son was 17 and really struggling in school. And I was sitting at the dining room table. My laptop was open, and he came in kind of a rush, as 17-year-olds do. And he said, "Mom, I need," and I remember looking straight at him and saying, "Just a second, Jacob. Let me finish this email. If I lose my train of thought, I'll lose it." And I said, "Just give me a second." So I finished my email and I closed my laptop and I looked straight at him. And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And he asked me the question. I kind of gave him an answer and he walked away. And the next time, a few days later, he came back and kind of the same thing happened. And I was on my phone. And I remember specifically looking at my phone and then turning it face down on the table and looking straight at him and saying, "Okay, what do you need?" And he sat down. My 17-year-old kid, who I could barely get more than a one-word sentence out of him, sat down and told me what he wanted to tell me. And we had an exchange, and it was maybe 3 minutes, which is a long time to
Right.
talk to a 17-year-old boy or girl for that matter. But he stood up and he looked straight at me and he said, "Thanks, Mom." And he walked away. And I remember having this incredible, deep sense of satisfaction after that conversation, simply because he knew I was listening to him, that he was heard. So that story, I can see your face. Like you're going, "Oh yeah, I can relate to that." Even if you don't have kids, you can relate to that sense of satisfaction when a conversation goes well. So that's not an epic story. I mean, it is epic if you know teenagers,
Right.
but in general, it's not an epic story, but it's meaningful. And you have that sense of emotion. So that's the first. The next mistake people make as far as those stories is that they think in terms of timeline. They think of suffering or struggle in terms of this a time period as opposed to demonstrating it in one specific story. So I could talk about the year that my father was sick and when he died. I could talk about that year, but far more emotionally connecting to somebody and inspiring to somebody might be a very specific conversation I had with my dad about pain, about not wanting to see him in pain, and how important it was that I used my words in that conversation. So even though I'm not describing the entire year of that awful and incredibly growing opportunity of spending that time, I'm demonstrating what that year was like for me in the context of one period of time, one
Okay.
episode.
Yeah, both of those things make a lot of sense. And it's funny, I remember thinking that so much of what our kids try to learn in school, what we try to learn in school, part of the reason we can't learn it is because it's kind of stamped into textbook format where all of the
Mm-hmm.
stuff you talk about is removed and the timelines are inserted, as many facts as possible are crammed in, and all those facts are arguably important, but there's no resonance. And so it's really hard to read a history textbook. It could be the most fascinating episode of the history of the world, but you read it in a history textbook and you're just like, this stinks. And
Exactly.
same thing happens when you look at people's websites and about me sections of their LinkedIn profile and so on. They kind of turn it into a history textbook and they take out all the awesome stuff like you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And just to add one more thing, when people are thinking about what story to share, and they know they have an internal message that is damaging their confidence or damaging their ability to connect with people, the whole I'm not very smart, I'm not very bright. I've heard that from people who are incredibly bright. Um, but when we uncover the story that led to that and we develop context around it, what was going on around you, what happened to trigger that conversation with somebody who told you you weren't very bright, what were they going through, then suddenly it paints this full picture with context around this one incident that you've been holding on to for 30 or 40 or 50 years. And it puts it into technicolor, and all of a sudden there's like this light comes on and you realize, oh, that's not what that was about. That's not the message I should be taking from that story. I was wrong all these years.
Right. It's amazing how some little thing, kind of like a little snowball rolling down the hill, ends up like an avalanche months, years, decades later, when really it had nothing to do with anything. And there might be other incidences that were equally or perhaps even more jarring or harsher or whatever, that for whatever reason they don't stick, they don't roll, and we just forget about them and move on. And I've always been curious about kind of what is it about the things that we hold on to and the things that we don't.
Mm-hmm. I love that imagery, the snowball. That's a great image. Thanks, Ruben.
Oh, thanks. And it's kind of like you say, right? When we have something concrete to visualize or something emotional to relate to, that makes it easier to understand because that's how we're supposed to think in our heads, I guess, and how we're supposed to relate to other people. So, okay, so sorry, I'm talking too much and not letting you talk because what I
No,
want
no,
to hear
no. I
from
like
people
this.
is, so how do we figure out, because we might have all kinds of stories, right? Like people might even they might see a business coach, they might see a therapist, they might have many things going on in their lives. I assume we can't fix them all at once. But for example, for folks listening to this, a lot of them may have internalized certain negative stories about sales or marketing. So I'm told. How can they figure out where those are coming from and take some action on it so that they can go do the stuff and share some of their magic, as you say?
Well, I would start with knowing that there's no such thing as a light bulb moment. I don't believe you go from dark to light where all of a sudden you're aware of something. I really believe in a dimmer switch. And so there's like this series of events, but it's the one trigger point that flips that switch to full on bright that we usually remember. We don't usually remember those little episodes that are leading us to that full-on bright light. So actually, this is part of my book, is that it has worksheets and exercises to help you uncover some of those stories. There's a whole section on internal messages where I talk about some of my internal messages and the stories that generated those. And if you can figure out an origin story, there isn't just one, but if you figure out one of your origin stories of that message, then you can start to build context around it. And there's a thing called cognitive dissonance, which is where you may have tons of evidence that you're smart, but because of one incident, you decide you're not very bright. And as an example of that, I was working with a coaching client who struggled in math as a kid, not for her whole life, but as a kid in school, struggled with math. She was great at English, amazing at drawing. Like, this woman sketches like you would not believe, just super talented in other areas, but she wasn't so great at math. And so she decided she wasn't very bright. So regardless of all the A's that she was getting in English, all the A's she got in history, the amazing outpouring of support in her artistry, she wasn't very bright because she couldn't do math. So that's an example of cognitive dissonance. So we had to kind of uncover where that came from, this I'm not good at math. Because just because you're not good at algebra in 7th or 8th grade doesn't mean you're not good at math. Because there are all kinds of components to math. And so we had to uncover when something happened where somebody told her she wasn't good at math, or where she failed a math class, and start to uncover the situation around it and start to look for evidence of the times she was actually really good at math, like when she went to nursing school. And she had to become good at math when it came to pharmaceuticals. So it's really a matter of finding those origin stories, and you can uncover those in many ways. One way to do that is to simply start thinking about the times where you felt very small, where somebody insulted you, because that is almost always an origin story. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think it does partly. And I think, I'm sure you could read the book and listen to all 180 episodes and still not have the complete answer, because it's a complex thing, right? This is something that people have struggled with since there have been people. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a helpful start. And I think for a lot of folks listening, whether they're good at math or not, I'm guessing a fair number of people are going to say, I'm not good at sales, right? I can't be good at sales. Sales sucks, blah, 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 blah. And they probably have some moments, like I had lots of moments where I had bad experiences being sold to, or as part of a sales team where I felt like the sales guys were not doing right by the client or us engineers or whatever, right? So I internalized all this stuff. And it took me, like you say, there was a dimmer switch, great analogy as well, to realize that I was imposing my own view on something that might be accurate here and there, but wasn't representative of everything and wasn't representative of what I had to be. So I think that's really helpful. And I guess, so the first step is, like, one, recognizing that this is going on, and then two, kind of figuring it out in your own head. And then how do you take these stories to the world so that you can communicate better, so that you get more clients, so that you have better relationships, and so on?
Well, really, I think it takes practice. Well, I know it takes practice. This isn't something that happens overnight. And as an example, I was working with a client who is an executive level HR professional, and she was looking for a job. And she has amazing experiences, successful experiences, but she didn't know how to tell certain stories in a way that demonstrated what she was really good at. So one of the things that we did was we started working through the stories of her successes at work and identifying and categorizing them. So here's a story that demonstrates how I develop people. Here's a great story that demonstrates how I work interactively and engagingly with other departments. Here's a great story that demonstrates my ambition and ability to quickly learn. So if you think about that in the context of, say, sales, if you start collecting the stories of the clients that you helped, a client that, so for instance, this was my perfect sales story, right? I had this client that was looking for a new job and she didn't know how to do this. And we created an entire story portfolio so that at any interview, she was prepared with a 3-minute story. We practiced. She practiced in between our coaching sessions and she got her dream job. This woman is so excited. She knew that the wait was worth it, that all the time before working with me, all of the learning experiences she had made her ready for where she is now. So when she tells that story, she inspires others.
That's great. And I bet a lot of people are thinking, well, gee, that's an awful lot of work. I can't come up with a whole bunch of stories and practice them for 3 minutes and blah, 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 blah. And I guess my thought is people are doing this already. We're always telling ourselves stories. And the question is, are you telling the right stories for yourself and for where you want to go? Or are you doing it, sort of haphazardly and letting your lizard brain tell the stories for you?
Exactly. Well, it really helps to have categories. And I actually have a worksheet that I use with some of my clients, particularly team clients who are trying to develop stories within their organization to be able to use when they need them. And so we create these categories, and it really is not a huge investment of time or resources because when something happens, say somebody has a great success, a sales success story where the client is incredibly satisfied, they see their bottom line go up as a result of implementing this product. They're more organized. They feel more confident, whatever the success is. And if you just jot down a phrase to remind you of that story, a particular incident with that person. So how you got them to work with you. What was your first meeting like? What happened in that meeting? Where were you sitting? What were the ideas that were shared? And why did they suddenly look up with light in their eyes and realize that they hit a gold mine? What was it that you said, or what was it that they said that really was inspiring to you? And you just jot down a few phrases. You don't have to write out paragraphs of stories. Jot down a few phrases so that when the opportunity arises, you have that story ready to share with the next potential client so that you don't have to tell them, oh, this is what I do. I'm really good at ABC. Instead, you tell them this story, like I did about this woman that was looking for a job. Tell the story of this other client's success, and then you don't have to say, oh, I'm really smart, or I'm a team player, or
Right.
I'm really good at this. There, there's no reason to believe those statements, but if you can tell a story that demonstrates them, you can't go wrong.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about stories? It's one thing to have a story that we tell at an interview or a sales meeting or behind a podium or whatever. What of these stories do we share online, on social media, on our websites, etc.? How can people use these stories effectively there?
Well, again, I would encourage you to develop some categories. Think about your personal brand and your skills or the services you provide and what you want people to know about those things. So if you want to demonstrate your resilience, um, make sure you have stories that demonstrate that. And they can be short. Like I said, they don't have to be epic. They can be a short story about climbing a mountain and hitting a point where you thought you couldn't go any further, or anything like that. You were training a puppy and you hit a point where you thought, I just can't do this. And then there was a turning point. So you can demonstrate all kinds of character and values in that story. Think about how you want to demonstrate that you are great at what you do. So, for instance, when I like to demonstrate that I'm a good cook, I don't tell people I'm a really good cook. I tell them a story about something I made. I talk about this pizza that came out of our wood-fired pizza oven that we installed in our backyard. And I had perfected the crust. It was really the Tuscan style crust that comes out of the oven of 500 or 600 degree oven with the sides all bubbled up and crisp. But when you break into it, it has that elasticy texture of the crust. It's like magic. And the topping, my favorite topping is this brown butter with chopped up sage that gets crisp when you're sauteing it with the butter. And then just put some capers and a little bit of chev, the goat cheese on top. Amazing.
I just had dinner and I'm hungry already.
Exactly. So write your categories. What character traits do you want to demonstrate in your stories? What skills do you want to demonstrate in your stories? As I said with an interview person, when you know you're going in for interviews, what are the likely questions people are going to ask you if you are trying to get a job as tech support, as an HR executive, as you know what questions they're going to ask you. They're all based on the job description. It's pretty straightforward. Figure out which stories demonstrate those qualities, those skills, those talents in very clear ways, and just jot down phrases and create your story portfolio.
Now, would it be fair to say to all those folks out there, I can't tell you how many consulting websites I see that say, we strive to exceed customer expectations. Customer service is our highest priority, blah, 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 blah. What I'm gathering is they would be much better served by having a story about how they actually did something awesome for their clients, or maybe even having their clients tell that story.
Well, that's why testimonials are so powerful. Why would you tell people what you do well when you have a client that can tell people what you do well? Let them do the work.
Amen. So if people want to find out more or work with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. Elkinsconsulting.com is on LinkedIn, but I would suggest you just reach out to me directly. And my tagline on LinkedIn is "The smile is free."
Love it.
And my elkinsconsulting.com website has all my contact information. It talks about all the Gallup StrengthsFinder team workshops that I do, the keynote presentations that I love to do, and also the one-to-one coaching that I do and I enjoy immensely.
Awesome. And I understand you have some cool lead magnets on there too.
I do have at least one.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Did something in this episode or a past episode help you out? I'd love to hear about it. Send comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes to hello@salesfornerds.io. And of course, iTunes reviews are super helpful for getting the word out. So if you've got a few moments to put one of those up, I'd really appreciate it. If you got a friend who'd benefit from one of these episodes, send a link. If you got a friend who wouldn't benefit from one of the episodes, but you just haven't talked to in a while, this is a great excuse to pick up the phone and give them a call. Of course, if you're looking for a whole new take on CRM for solo consultants, along with proposal templates, lead magnet ideas, free positioning tools, and more, check it out at mimiran.com. That's MIMIRAN.com. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time.